Hello and welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. With me is Professor Pant from the Observer Research Foundation. From last week to this, a lot has been happening in the geopolitical and geostrategic spheres around the world. And there has been a lot of activity from last week to now. US has hardened its stance against China in the South China Sea, vis-a-vis Hong Kong. We've seen that the US and China tussle is now playing out in Iran as well. Along with that, India's interest in Iran has been, if I may use that word, damaged to some extent. And there are questions about India's strategic concerns in Iran as Iran and China come closer. So Harsh, we will look at all of this and also the India-EU summit, but let's start with Iran. US and China tussle has reached Tehran now, and there is new challenge for India, which has been balancing its relation between America and Iran for a while. But now there is a problem. Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear treaty has brought Beijing and Tehran closer now. And probably we cannot blame Iran because it coming close to Beijing gives it that much needed economic lifeline. How do we look at this from the point of view of India?
Well, thank you, Naghma. And I think, in some ways, what we are looking at, in Iran today is a smaller manifestation of a larger global political reality that we face, which is the structural contestation between two major powers is becoming more and more acute. In Iran, in particular, China's role in Iran is not a new story. It has been growing over the last 2 decades. But what Mr. Trump's idea of reneging on the nuclear deal meant was that China had a field day. China had an open space in Iran, which it went in and tried to fill, that void that was left by the initial engagement of America, initial engagement from European Union, initial engagement from other countries that were before the Obama nuclear deal were reluctant to commit to Iran. They were coming in gradually. But Mr. Trump decided that he had to take a hard line for various reasons, and the result is that that space has been now completely captured by China. If the agreement that is in the news that is being talked about actually fructifies, actually finalizes, then I think China's role becomes very, very significant, given that Iran is virtually economically crippled. And so there is nothing left there for Iran to really look to others. It had been asking for a lot of support from European Union, but European Union has been unable to provide. So in that context, the role of India becomes very, very important. And India, of course, has been trying to, make a case that, look, we have multiple stakes in Middle East, whether it is our Arab Gulf countries, whether it's Iran and whether it's Israel. We have tried to create a sort of a balance. But the reality has always been that our relations with the Arab Gulf states and with Israel have been much stronger compared to Iran, primarily because Iran had been an outlier in the international economic order. So as India integrated itself into the Middle East, India found that Iran is something that complicates matters a lot. And so the result is that the one strategic investment that India made in Iran was Chabahar. And Chabahar virtually has been going back and forth on that because of what America has been trying to do to Iran. All the blame cannot be laid at Indian doorsteps. I think we have seen in the past, Iran has also been equally fidgety. Iran has been using Chabahar, many would claim, also as a bargaining tactic with the US, with other countries, and making a case that, look, this is something that you can come and invest, but also we will look at other, we will explore other options, in particular yes. China and Pakistan. But despite that, if you see in the last few years, we have, Chabahar's first phase was completed. And in fact, India was trying to engage more substantively in Iran. But I think the real setback here, if one can call it that, is the fact that conflicting reports have emerged about the Zahedan, Chabahar railway line, which was supposed to be, completed and which was supposed to be India's project that India had initiated. And now we are told that that is something that perhaps India is not, that India may not get it because China might be brought in, although Iranian officials are saying that that they remain committed, or at least they have not yet let India out of the project. So there are conflicting reports there, but it's not entirely evident where the real problem lies.
Okay, so Harsh, you were talking about the Chabahar project. The Chabahar, you said Iran has been in fact using it to bargain between India and the other countries, but India always saw it, or at least projected it as a very exclusive Indian project there, and it was considered as an, if I may use the word, a strategic magnum opus of India in Iran, and it's also a connection between India, Afghanistan, Iran, and Central Asia. But now, and it was seen as a counterbalance to the Gwadar port, which the Chinese control in Pakistan. But now that India's presence is not there, and the apparent reason is that India was not able to complete it. One of the reasons also because of the sanctions that the US had put, which made it difficult, the whole completion. We see this Cold War II now playing out in India's East and West. What are the real options? What is the big picture that's emerging here?
Well, the big picture that is emerging is that there are certain things that are beyond India's control. And I think the structural factors will increasingly impinge on Indian foreign policy, and we should be cognizant of those realities. And I think, when you look at what is happening in Iran, Iran will make its foreign policy calculus based on its larger foreign policy paradigm, which is that it has to balance a lack of support from the West with greater support from China. Now, that means that Indian interests will be targeted, Indian interests will be negatively impacted, and India should be cognizant of that reality. What seems to have been happening now is that Chabahar, though we got waivers from the US, given the fact that larger sanctions have been there, India could not actually make it a viable project, and Iran was not a real help in that regard. And also the fact that the railway line project from Zahedan, from Chabahar to Zahedan, which was again very, very important, given that it allowed India, or it potentially allows India an access to Afghanistan and Central Asia. That project has now, being, as we were discussing earlier, has been under contestation, whether it is still with India, whether India will be part of it, and under what terms and conditions. If China is the main player now in Iran, then clearly it limits India's options. It puts constraints on what India can potentially do in Iran and what sort of an engagement it can visualize with Iran. Now, see, China is in the larger Middle East also, China is present. But I think what we are now talking of is a real structural shift in Iran, where Iran is now asking China to invest in around 400 million, I think is the amount that is being talked about.
400 million.
And not only in infrastructure projects, but also in things like 5G, which potentially can lead the foundation for the next stage of economic regeneration in Iran. There is also talk of ports, strategic ports. There is even talk of some ports being sold to Iran. So clearly, in its Straits of Hormuz. So clearly, when you look at how China is playing this game, whether or not, I mean, again, the question is when it's entirely possible that nothing of this will happen, given China's track record, given the potential problems that countries face, given that some people, even former President Ahmadinejad, for example, have been critical of a greater engagement with China in Iran's domestic politics. So clearly, we will see some domestic political contestation happening. But I think for Iran, the question is that if no one else is coming to Iran's help, or if no one else is investing in Iran, then why not China? What can happen potentially? They are already badly placed as far as economic realities are concerned. So for India, that acknowledgement needs to be there, and we need to see what we can, what sort of an enclave perhaps we can carve out for ourselves in the larger diplomatic foreign policy landscape of Iran. But my sense is that Iran has always been a very, very difficult negotiator for India. It was not simply the fact that American sanctions were imposed, but also the fact that Iranians think that bargaining itself is an end product rather than an output. And I think that creates complications for India-Iran relationship, and also India's larger stakes in the region, which have grown substantively in the Arab Gulf states as well as in Israel.
Yeah, yeah. But Harsh, as you mentioned, Iran has been a different negotiator, before difficult negotiator. Before we move on to the next question, just a small comment from you. How do we look at this whole thing? Because when, as you mentioned, $400 billion is what China is investing in Iran, in the infrastructure project, oil projects and oil and gas. But when you look at India, do you feel that it's a setback for India, for Chabahar? Because here India has been, in fact, squeezed out. But what's happening in Nepal? So everywhere, where India's presence was there, and we were, we now see that China is there, and India has to now look at the options that where can you place yourself domestically?
Well, Naghma, China was always there. Today, I think, because we are entering into a more and more adversarial relationship with China, I think the costs for India are going to be increasingly higher, and therefore, at times the debate in India is now whether India should also make its priorities more explicit. See, we lived in a world where it was feasible for India to say that, look, we have great partnerships with Arab Gulf states, with Iran and with Israel at the same time. Mm-hmm. But I don't think today's world acknowledges that balancing framework. Today's world is very different, where countries are making explicit choices. So I think in the end, it seems to me that India will also have to acknowledge that, look, our stakes in the Arab Gulf states are far higher. Our stakes in Israel are growing, whereas our stakes in Iran are declining. And if that is the case, then it is for both India and Iran to acknowledge the limits of their partnership. We have often said, oh, it's a historical relationship, civilizational partnership. But I think in today's context, they mean very little when the output is so limited.
Trump has made his choices very explicit. He has hardened his stance against China in South China Sea. In Hong Kong, he has signed an executive order which ends the preferential treatment that Hong Kong was getting. He talks of more punishment, but China is also saying that it is also going to push back. So we see the confrontation. We see that China has vowed to pay back. What looks like as the future of this financial center and the South China Sea? Of course, Secretary Pompeo has said that the world will not allow China to treat South China Sea as its maritime empire. So this hardening of stance, the elections are there in November, and all that he's doing, because he cannot really campaign, is talk about China.
Yes, I think China has become a very, very important factor in terms of projecting a sense of leadership, in terms of projecting a sense of being in control, because everything else is falling out of his control, it seems, of the Trump administration. But here, what is interesting is that American policymakers are also tapping into a wider discontent in the region. So you saw that it was ASEAN that came out first and said, look, any discussion with China on South China Sea will have to be based on 1982 UNCLOS, in laws of the sea. So increasingly, I think you are looking at the regional environment, which is challenging China. Australia's defense white paper, Japanese defense white papers, both very, very categorical in terms of where China is going and what these countries are doing to stand up to China. And they are very strong documents. Similarly, India, of course, is in its own way challenging China in the Himalayas. It's also trying to make a case in the larger maritime space. And so you have the entry of the US. And US and Trump administration is making a case both to its domestic audience and to its regional interlocutors that it remains a viable player. Remember a few months back, a year or so back, there was this wider problem in the region that America is just not serious about the region, that America is withdrawing from the region. So now I think a message is going out that America is back in business, that America will take on China frontally, whether it is through the explicit demonstration of firepower or by challenging some of those older assumptions on South China Sea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. Now the question is that, as you said, this is an election year. What happens during these few months? Countries still would hedge their bets. When they would look at America, they would see an America that is in the throes of an economic crisis, and therefore, what happens post January 2021 is the real issue here, not what Mr. Trump is saying at the moment. He and his administration can be very hawkish, but I think few countries will take that into account. I mean, I agree with the larger proposition that there has been a change in the American mindset, in the American policymaking mindset about China. But I still think there are some significant differences between the way a Biden administration would approach China and the way the Trump administration would approach China. And I think we'll have to wait and watch.
The same with Iran. The Biden administration will probably look at it differently than what Trump administration may look at. But when we talk about European Union, we've just had a EU-India summit. EU wants to make its presence felt in Asia too. And EU says that it's very interested in being an active player here with, there were, the usual platitudes of power dynamic shift and how EU wants to play a major role here. But we see that there are divergent views as far as China is concerned. India has a different view, EU has a different view. Prime Minister Modi very clearly pointed at the elephant in the room, but European Union saying that they want both countries to be at peace with each other, both are democracies. So, the divergent views and not really accepting China's, the way China has projected its aggression in the region. How do you look at this EU-India summit and what came out of it?
I think the summit, by and large, was useful because to have a summit like this, which was being postponed in the past, which was getting postponed in the past, certainly sends out a message that both sides are serious about each other. But the larger point that you make is very, very valid and still remains a valid one. I think this has been a problem in Indo-European engagement in the past as well, that we want to talk geopolitics, they want to talk geoeconomics. And I think that is where a certain conflict appears. It's not that we don't want to talk about economics and trade and investment, but I think their focus primarily, especially in these economically problematic times, has been on economic and trade ties. And therefore, for them to challenge China frontally is something that is going to be a problem. So European Union, therefore, has taken a very, very cautious position. They were not, the position on the Galvan crisis was also, trying to balance both sides. And even during the summit, where the Prime Minister, Indian Prime Minister, was very categorical about the challenge that India faces, I think they were more talking in normative terms, that India and the EU both are democratic entities that value freedom and human rights and the larger normative framework. But I think when it comes to operationalization of that normative reality, there is going to be a problem, because European Union is not in a position to antagonize China at this stage, and therefore they want to carry on, with the process as usual. Now, it's not that things are not changing there. I mean, we know the last month's EU-China crisis, EU-China summit did not end up with a joint resolution. So clearly, I think they also recognize that India and China are two very distinct entities, where India's engagement in the wider global order is premised on India's engagement with the larger normative, institutional, and other frameworks that European Union also espouses. Whereas China's engagement with the larger process is primarily about, changing the status quo, which I think many in European Union would find very, very uncomfortable. But what we are looking at is a short-term dynamic where European Union might find it difficult to challenge some of those on China on some of those issues on which India is increasingly now challenging China. And I think we are at that stage in the relationship where perhaps a frank conversation between India and the EU on this particular fault line is important, is essential. And I'm glad that it happened, and the way it was raised, Prime Minister of India raised it in a certain way, European Union raised it in a certain way, exposing the undercurrent in both countries, exposing the challenge that the two entities have in really making India-EU partnership a strategic partnership.
Yeah, well, they talked about both India and the EU, respecting the universal values of democracy. But how about, did you see anything very forthright coming from the EU? Because Prime Minister Modi was very forthright in pointing at the challenges that India faces. He also mentioned the recent face-off, the challenges that we are facing from China. Like you said, EU probably is not in a position to, say anything more openly about China. What does that really show about China's increasing power and about a shift in the power that we are talking or looking at, and the power dynamics? How has it shifted?
I think it tells us this, that's the story of our times, where China has become so ingrained in various geographies because of the sheer weight of its economic might, that even an entity which you would think is very powerful, like the European Union, is finding it very difficult to articulate a robust response to the challenge that actually should be most worrying to the European Union, because this is a challenge to the multilateral institutional framework, and this is something on which European Union has believed more than any other entity. They always criticize America for being this hard power country. They've always criticized America for being not taking into account the larger multilateral frameworks. But here is a China that is tearing up all the international treaties, international norms, international institutions, and they have been unable to come to terms with that reality. Partly, I think, as we were discussing, that their economic, economies and economic problems that they are facing, how to engage with the rest of the world at this critical point, but also partly, like other parts of the world, they also feel a bit, let down by the US. There is also a sense that in the past, it was the US that led, and European Union bolstered that presence. Today, when you look at the US, which is, as we were discussing, which is sort of consumed by its internal matters, yes, it's trying to project a certain sense of very robust China policy, but this is happening at a time of elections, and it's not entirely clear the longevity of how long this would remain. And so you find a lack of certainty in the US response. And that lack of certainty also gets translated into how European Union looks at it, and how European Union feels vulnerable. That, in so long as America was clear about its strategic direction, it was fine for European Union to be the normative power. It was also fine for them to take on positions on certain critical issues. Now, when America seems to be on a retreat, or at least is not giving that indication that it has a certain strategic coherence, then I think it also creates problems for European Union and its own perception of its own role in the world. And I think they're grappling with it. We know that they have become more serious about India in the last few years. We know that there is a lack, that there is growing concern about China. It's a huge block of countries, 27 odd countries. They will eventually come to some conclusion, but I think they always, as is their wont, they take time in coming to that consensus. And I'm sure eventually that consensus will be what favorable to India. But at the moment, it looks very incoherent.
All right. Yes, we see that China continues to put pressure on a rule-based world order, but very few countries are probably in a position to take on the challenge that China is posing. So thank you very much for that discussion and analysis, Professor Harsh Pant. That's it from us on this episode of Ideas Factory.